Welcome to the second episode of Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Today, I'm your host, Katie Shipp, the Executive Director of the nonprofit I Have the Right To, and I am joined by two remarkable individuals and co-hosts for this podcast, Susan and Alex Prout, co-founders of I Have the Right To. We are together today to continue our conversation from the first episode, dive deeper into some of the topics we discussed, and talk about what I Have the Right To is up to now. Let's get started. Hi, Alex and Susan. Thank you for joining us again.
Hi, Katie.
Hey, Katie.
So I was so grateful to have our first conversation with the two of you, and there was so much that we wanted to cover that we weren't able to cover it all in the first episode. So thank you for coming back for a second conversation where we can dive into some more topics and discuss what we were hoping to discuss with the first episode. I was reflecting a bit on our conversation during our first episode, and the thought of the perfect victim kept coming to mind. We often hear about that, the perfect victim. In a lot of ways, Chessy behaved in all the ways people say a victim should behave. She said no, she reported shortly after the assault, she told the school, she went to the police, she had a rape kit performed. And even though she did all of this, she was still met with disdain and provided no support while the school community rallied around the victim. And it kept making me think of one of my favorite videos of Chessy, where she ends the video by saying there's no such thing as a perfect victim. And it's a standard that society has that no person can really meet. And so I'd love to hear your perspectives on this and what you would want any survivors listening to this podcast to know.
That's a great question, Katie. Thank you. So one of the first kind of permutations of, quote, perfect victim we heard was from another parent on campus. And she came up to us all flustered and said, "I'm so sorry. I heard what's happened to Chessy. And that happened to me too on my college campus. I was pulled from the bushes by a stranger." And then the next day she came up and said, "Oh, well, I heard it's a little different than I thought." And you could tell like she was icy to us about Chessy's sexual assault immediately. So the first one is that it's a misnomer. You're assaulted by a stranger in a dark alley or from the bushes. I think over 90% of sexual assaults happen by someone that you know. So let's get that statistic out there far and wide. And that's actually a big part of, quote unquote, the perfect victim.
If I can quickly, yeah. Susan, I just want to back up what you said. I spent over 10 years representing survivors of sexual abuse as an attorney. I've represented hundreds of survivors. And what I can say is in all of those cases, not one of the perpetrators was a stranger. So I just want to back up that my experience 100% supports what you're saying.
Thank you, Katie. I'm really not surprised, right? So, and then, the second part of it all was that, they were going to choose to believe that and I don't even like calling him this, the quote unquote star student had more credibility than these are some of the words they used to describe Chessy: naive, flummoxed. These are all written by a Vanity Fair writer, Todd Purdom, at one point. She was only 15 and, really didn't know what she was doing. And yet he had been a star athlete, academics, all that. So let's just put aside those kinds of measurements at all about the victim and perpetrator. There are all kinds of perpetrators out there. And the truth of the matter is we don't want to believe that people can do this to somebody else, and we'd rather believe someone did something wrong. And then there was the other issue. I mean, let's just put it out there. The prosecutor that took the case actually went against her colleague who said, I don't like the fact pattern. He happened to be a male. And Catherine Ruffle said, if we don't start taking these cases with fact patterns that could be difficult, she said yes to going with him. She said yes to certain actions, then we are never going to make a dent on sexual assault crimes. And so if it hadn't been for Catherine Ruffle recognizing that, yes, you can willingly go with someone and still be sexually assaulted, then we wouldn't be here talking with you today about this experience. So people have to understand that there are both and statements out there in sexual assault. So you can, be on a date and willingly be with someone and be sexually assaulted.
Yes.
So,
I don't even understand what the phrase perfect victim is meant to mean or why it's brought up. We've dealt with thousands of survivors over our time after Chessy's assault, Katie. And and Suze, I'll speak for you. Correct me if I'm overstating, but every victim, every survivor that we have engaged with is a human being worthy of dignity and respect. And that's it, full stop. They're a human being that is victimized by someone. And who is that someone? A perpetrator. I would prefer to focus on the perpetrator and the perpetrator's behavior, motives, actions. And I think it's so unfortunate that the victim in this crime becomes the central figure. And I still don't understand that. Yes, I understand that this is a particular crime where the victim is also the crime scene, but that still doesn't change the fact that there is a perpetrator involved. And to me, all that matters is who did this damage to another human being, who took away someone's feeling of safety and well-being and trust, who committed a crime, and why did they do it? Because we need to understand the whys of a perpetrator's behaviors if we're going to make a dent in this issue. We're not going to change the fact of sexual violence in our society by creating blue lights on campus, by telling women don't walk in the dark, walk with keys stuck between your fingers at night, don't do this, don't do that. We need to find other ways to stop this issue.
Yeah, and I think just going back to Chessie's own words, there is no such thing as a perfect victim, and someone else's views on how somebody should have responded should never be used to silence somebody. And thankfully, Chessy still used her voice and spoke up. And I think we as an organization just want to encourage every survivor to speak up and use their voice and be there to support them.
Yes, this gets me upset, Katie. If I had my car stolen, should a policeman ask me, why'd you park on that dark street? Right? Do you leave your keys in the car? Was the doors unlocked? Weren't you asking to have your car stolen by those actions? No, those are laughable, insane questions. But those are the questions that are asked of every victim of sexual violence. What did you do to deserve what happened to you? And yes, I feel passionate about it because I'm a father of a survivor. But if I pause to think 2 seconds about it as a human being, that is such a ridiculous thing to think and consider. This is part of the vernacular that we need to change in our culture.
And that's why raising awareness is so important, so that these tactics that Chessy saw during her criminal trial, how many years ago, they're still happening today. And we have to raise awareness amongst our young people in order to change those perceptions and to change those thought processes, so that instead of looking at the victim and trying to blame the victim for what they went through, instead we're looking at the crime and how to prevent it and how to support the victim and the survivor. Alex, when we spoke during the last episode, you mentioned a term called institutional betrayal. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about what is institutional betrayal? I know that you spoke about the fact that St. Paul's had noticed of a history of abuse at the school, and they even knew about this specific ritual known as the senior salute at the school. And even more specifically, there were concerns raised about the perpetrator in Chessy's case. Can you talk a little bit about the institutional betrayal that happened and how the school could have gotten it different if there wasn't that institutional betrayal present?
Yes. And, this is a term, I was aware of it because it was happening to us at the moment by St. Paul's School and its board of trustees, its lawyers, and the insurance company behind it. But I did not have a name for it until I read some absolutely brilliant writing. And I suggest everyone research and study Dr. Jennifer Fried of the Institute for
Institutional Courage.
the Center for Institutional Courage. Thank you. It was reading her work and research that I understood the meaning of institutional complicity, institutional betrayal, and institutional courage. Dr. Fry does a brilliant job of laying out the spectrum there. And, it was very hard because I went to St. Paul's School. I loved the school. I was a financial supporter of the school. I was an active ambassador. I sent my two daughters there. So to come to the realization that St. Paul's School was not only, acting in a complicit way in terms of the rape culture that existed on campus, but was actually an active participant in it, and therefore was perpetrating institutional betrayal upon its community members. This was a hard thing for me to accept because the school is externally beautiful. The website portrays happy faces, but there are many, many people that have been damaged and hurt at that school. And that might not be the experience of the vast, majority of alumni there, but it's not, that doesn't make any less unacceptable what's happened to too many students at St. Paul's. And the issue is compounded, as we talked about on the last episode, this secondary victimization. When victims don't receive validation, acknowledgement of what happened to them and the harm done to them, it makes them question themselves and makes them feel things that they shouldn't be feeling as a victim of a crime. They shouldn't feel doubt. They shouldn't feel blame and shame. But the school, through its intentional activities, was denying what happened to them, referring to these hundreds of incidents as isolated incidents, that there's nothing wrong with their culture when, predatory games were a tradition at the campus. So I think it's important, we need these kind of labels because if we're going to bring any kind of change, we need to know what we're changing. And institutional betrayal is present in so many institutions where we see rape culture thriving. The Boy Scouts, in athletic programs in Michigan State or in Olympic sports, in our Catholic Church, in other religious organizations. Did I mention the Boy Scouts? There's so many institutions that are guilty of institutional betrayal, where they have taken the path that the reputation of the institution is more important than the people that constitute that institution or that institution serves. And that to me means then these institutions are no longer legitimate. They do not deserve the right to function and exist under the banners that they publicly portray. If you look at St. Paul's website, there's no mention of the history of, betrayal by the institution. There's a lot of talk about how the school cares about its students and is producing fine, outstanding, upstanding citizens. And, that can't be true when they have decades-long history of denial, cover-up, and worse, actively silencing victims to keep this news from going public.
Thank you, Alex. That was really helpful. Alex and Susan, both of you, can you talk about how the betrayal that you felt from individuals within the community and the betrayal that Chessy had to endure, as well as the institutional betrayal And then also the outpouring of support that you felt once Chessy went forward, spoke up publicly, and shared her identity, and also wrote her book, how that inspired you to found the nonprofit organization I Have the Right To.
Sure. So I think we mentioned in the last episode that the betrayal came from the students, from their parents. It came from the rector of the school. It came from the chaplain of the school as well, who we also met with, who offered no support to Chessy. It came from the board of directors that we met with, that we had relationships with a number of them, and we had utterly dismal communications from them where everything was reduced to just,
Us moving on.
Yes, us moving on from the experience. So, I think it was basically from every sector that you could imagine from the school. And the kids that did support Chessy were the marginalized kids, and they were just a tiny handful. And that really tells you something.
And one thing that we learned, I don't know if we necessarily have the org that we have today if it weren't for the institutional betrayal by St. Paul's. Like I mentioned before, the Department of Justice and the Attorney General, who opened up a grand jury, found enough evidence to bring criminal charges against St. Paul's. So that should be a statement and a half about the school's, behavior. But if they didn't institute such outrageous institutional betrayal, we would not have learned so much about what victims face, because this is being practiced. St. Paul's did it in its typical alpha way, but this is being practiced in maybe subtler ways by so many institutions when something that might harm its reputation comes up in public. Instead of being focused on how do we improve and fix things, they become how do we circle the wagons. And what we learned as a family, starting with the love and support that Suze talked about in part one, is we found that for the healing path, first for Chessy, but then for all survivors to happen, you need love and support. And that has to start with acknowledgement and validation of what happened to the victim. We almost have a sacred mantra in the advocacy world about, listening to victims, believing them and supporting them and standing with them. And St. Paul's didn't do that. It hasn't done that for the past 70 years. And it continues to deny. We're working currently with victims from St. Paul's who have been silenced actively. So despite being under supervision by the Department of Justice, they still have chosen to stay the course that their lawyers and insurance companies suggest that they follow. And it's time for people to understand that and make decisions about, do I want my child to be part of an environment, like that? We are learning from it was we need to provide a culture and an atmosphere and a community of belief, love, and support for survivors. So that's, I think, what we very actively said we need to do. We didn't know at the very beginning what necessarily we would evolve to, but we knew what we needed, and we didn't face from the St. Paul's community. We needed that active love and support. And so, quite simply, Susan and I just started doing this organically with every victim that reached out to us as our case went more and more public. And we said we need to offer them love and support, right?
So in a lot of ways, you created the community that you wish you would have had so that other survivors never feel the way that Chessy felt, and other survivor families never feel the way that you felt, parents, siblings.
100%. Yep.
And we also wanted them to know we did, person by person, miracle relationship by miracle relationship, we did rebuild our community through those difficult times. So we also knew that there was, during it all, the most common phrase we said is there a light at the end of this tunnel? Mm-hmm. It was so dark. And we didn't know if we were going to get through it, but we were stubborn. And then people came out of nowhere to give us that love and support. And that gave us power to continue to move forward. And slowly, like, we always view Chessy as that little pebble that's dropped into a pool of still water. People think I'm a small pebble. What difference can I make? But you drop that pebble into a pool of still water, it makes ripples that continue forever. And it just continues making impacts. And we built such a wonderful community of fellow advocates, friends, supporters.
And we've done it by educating ourselves, Katie. We have spent these past almost 10 years since the trial, 9.5 years, educating ourselves about everything possible. And we have looked to the veterans, these amazing young people that came before us and before Chessy, the amazing Annie Clark and Andrea Pino, who worked on the hunting ground. And we were rapt. We couldn't understand. It came out the year of Chessy's assault, but we saw it a little bit after it. And we were shocked to see how rampant the sexual violence was. And so we came up here to Washington, D.C. very intentionally to connect ourselves with End Rape on Campus. And one of the first days here, moving here, we took my 70-year-old aunt to go picket in front of the Department of Education, where Betsy DeVos was rolling back Title IX provisions. And so we have spent, days, months, years educating ourselves on the history of advocacy and the thought leaders who've come before us and the thought leaders that we're walking hand in hand with now. So we've never been more hopeful. And there was a tunnel for a long time. And there are a couple of instances where I, got so excited by the lights. And one was someone from New York, from the Consent Awareness Network, defining consent. And I was so excited to see that someone was fighting to codify consent in our laws, which it is not codified there appropriately still yet in our states. And then another person, an author who has written an amazing book about how to educate teens on all the feelings they might be having when they interact with one another, and offering them real talk about, sex and consent. And so all of a sudden, this came together for us that there are ways beyond just consoling survivors and helping them through their trauma. There's ways to proactively teach students. And so that's what we started to do. And it all happened very organically.
Well, can I share with how it sort of evolved one day? And this is a Susan Bragg story. We had an intern, one of our first interns, who was giving a consent workshop at her university in New Jersey. And at this very privileged place, the young men that were listening to the consent discussion had some questions for her afterwards, which she was welcoming. And their question was, how far can we go before getting arrested? Was their question to her on the topic of consent. And I remember that coming back to Susan, who cares deeply about all of our interns, as I do. And I saw a flash of this power of Susan, and she got very upset at this, attitude of these privileged young men. Like, how far can I go without it being called rape and me facing some risk? And she declared this thing that we use as a mantra to today. Consent is the bare minimum. And I think there's some other colorful words, involved there. But that almost became a rallying cry for all of us, because when Susan said that, a light bulb in my mind went off saying, yes, we're spending so much time trying to get our society out of this air of rape culture that exists around us. And we're talking about just trying to get everyone to acknowledge there's a bare minimum that we need to achieve. We need to understand what is consent. The fact that, it wasn't codified in any law definition, when that's the basis of understanding is a crime committed or not, but there's no definition of consent, that's terrifying. And it's also ludicrous. But So trying to have discussions about, let's define consent and talk about consent, and let's talk about, building more diversity into our community spaces. And oh my gosh, we're seeing an issue with talking to our young men about issues of violence. Let's just engage our young men, where all of these things are just the bare minimum. And then, Susan, as she does, went right to work and said, this doesn't work. We're just raising awareness and trying to get people to aspire to the bare minimum. And from that point on, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was really an inflection point where we said, we need to set the bar higher, and saying, how do we set these aspirational targets where we're talking to people about how do they be the best versions of themselves, and how do we build thriving community spaces, and how do we unlock the power that we all have inherent in us from a positive perspective, if that makes sense.
I think it does. Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. We don't raise our kids in any regard to achieve minimum goals. It's, how can you take it to the level you're capable of, and
be the person you're meant to be.
And be the
Yes.
person you're meant to be, and not be afraid to be the person you're meant to be too.
And frankly, I'm raising my hand here now. I had the most learning to do. God blessed me with 3 wonderful daughters, and I've had to do a lot of learning as a man. I did not realize all of the privileges I had just because I was born a man. And I've had to evolve quite forcefully so over the last 10 years. And once your eyes are opened up to all of the obstacles and unfair things that are in front of anyone, whether it's, we look from a gender perspective, but whenever we look at any kind of power imbalance, the privileges that a few have and the obstacles and challenges that are unfairly put in front of others, this really accounts, I think, for a lot of the issues our society is facing today.
I just want to add, we're all products of our environment, right? And we're from a certain generation. The kids at St. Paul's, the kids that were the sleigh makers, and then the perpetrator, they're definitely, the perpetrator definitely did some criminal things, and there were other followers. So the whole idea is that we need to really just communicate better with people about what kind of person do you want to be. And so there was the situation where it was during the Kavanaugh hearing and through the Supreme Court, and we were asked to go speak to Holton Arms, and a student, a freshman student, to this day, I will forever be grateful for her hand raised, and how hard it must have been for her to raise her hand in her whole school, an all-girls school. And she said, "Are you talking to our brother schools?" And the whole auditorium erupted in this little, it was almost like a movie, all the kids snapping their fingers. And I was like, whoa, these girls are way too cool for me. And my colleague Elizabeth looked at them and said, "Not yet," in the way that she had. And so it took us 2 years to get to their brother school. But they were right. The message needed to be spread, and the vernacular and the ecosystem built of understanding how we interact, how we build cultures of consent with one another, and how everyone's safety depends on respect. How's that, Katie, for a segue?
So really, when you're looking at the timeline of I Have the Right To, it started with Chessy's journey, your family's journey through the criminal justice system, Chessy writing her book, I Have the Right To, the organization, the nonprofit organization, I Have the Right To, being formed and founded by your family in order to support survivors in raising awareness about the prevalence of sexual assault. And then the realization of the two of you that you wanted to get ahead of the problem. You wanted to go out there and have conversations with young people before this ever happens, to prevent it from happening, to raise awareness, and to get them thinking critically about the people that they wanted to be. And at first, that started with going out and sharing Chessy's story and your family's story, most of the time in girls' schools. And then it started to be in boys' schools as well, and co-ed schools. And I know that in this past year, I Have the Right To has reached over 16,500 students in over 30 different schools in 10 different states, with every school that we've been in inviting us back. And I have to say, that's pretty incredible growth from your vision to where we are at today. I'd love to hear more about the programming that we are doing in schools and just what you think of that timeline and how proud the two of you must be, as well as Chessy and the rest of your family, with what you've built. So just a little bit about that journey to where we are at now. And then I'd love to hear about some of the programs and initiatives that I Have the Right To is running and some of your favorites.
Absolutely. So some of the programming includes healthy relationships, empathetic leadership curriculum for students, educators, and parents. We do keynotes, workshops. We even do professional development with faculty. But truly, some of our most popular topics include healthy relationships, consent, upstanding, how to be an upstander in your community. Katie, this is one that I know kids love hearing you talk about, and that's digital safety and the neuroscience of trauma. And then there's a whole new arena that we're getting into. It's called aspirational masculinity, which I also like to refer to as aspirational humanity. I mean, how can we aspire to be the people that we are uniquely made to be and the best people we're made to be? And that's something that Alex has been leading. So I'll let you say a little bit more about that.
Yep. Well, you know, like everything we've done, Katie, it's all been so organic, and it really, and some, I don't know if the Alex from 4 or 5 years ago could have been this free in speaking about acknowledging that, we all come from love. As a guy, I'm not trained to it's not natural to say schmaltzy, stuff like that. But what I found through experience was it was love that got us through the trauma and the horrible things that happened to Chessy and the rest of the family. And it is through love that we can help others. And it's just, first step for me was acknowledging that fact. And then it became organically, just growing from that. So a lot of our workshops came from that feeling and foundation of love. And we never advertised, right? So it was so humbling to see people listening to our authentic messages and absorbing them and wanting more. We didn't have plans to set up this amazing curriculum that you've helped us, Katie, establish over the last 12 months. It's really been this organic journey of saying, what do we need and what is the next layer that we can sort of peel away? And for me, and this is something I share with all of the schools that we work with, I knew I needed a lot of work because when Susan called me up and to tell me that Chessy had been sexually assaulted, I was in New York at my mom's apartment where I grew up, packing my bags to go to London on a business trip. And when she called me, she told me the news and I screamed. I screamed as loud as I think I've ever screamed in my life. I could not replicate it ever again if I tried to. It was a visceral reaction, and what was coming out of me was anger and rage. And that was such a natural knee-jerk reaction. I was seeing red. And then the next emotion or action that I thought about was, I'm going to kill the guy who did this to my daughter. Again, a very reflexive, I didn't think about it. That was my reaction. And then the next strange emotion that rolled through me was, holy shoot, I failed as a dad. My job as a man, as a dad, was to protect my daughter, and I didn't do that. So I'm a failure. And so that's what rolled through me for the first couple of minutes after I digested the news. Then, as soon as I could take a breath, I sort of realized, oh my gosh, and with some reflection, Chessy and her well-being wasn't part of any of the reflexive reactions that I had. And I just had this moment where I said, I need to hub too. Susan told me, I've got this business trip to London is important. Go ahead. And, I'm like, no, I can't. I'll be there in 5 hours. I'm leaving now. And everything was just dropped. And that came from a feeling of love. But I made a note to myself, I need some work to do because I don't like that initial reaction. And I can tell you, Katie, speaking to a lot of dads and speaking to a lot of audiences, every man, and even women understand that's the reflexive reaction of every man when they hear this news. So that really led to, what can we do? What can I do to offset these messages of Andrew Tate and social media and pornography and other peer influence that our boys and young men are facing in society? And how do we set a better target for them to aspire to be? And it was really through spending dozens of hours with a mentor and dear friend of mine now, Don McPherson, who helped me. I asked him literally a direct question. Don, how do I speak constructively, positively to young men about this topic of sexual violence? Because I was still underneath filled with rage and anger. And through so much time spent with Don and then spending time with boys, it became easier for me to see I love young people and I want the best for them. So I needed to channel that energy to overcome my hangups. And what I've been taught was the man that I was, society was telling me to be. That wasn't good enough. I needed to be a whole man and embrace my wholeness and convey that to young people to say, there's so much that you can do and be if you just opened up yourself and understand this is what I really am. I'm loving, I'm kind, I can be sad, I can be lonely, I can be all of these things. A man doesn't need to be what society tells us to be. And what I found is that these conversations, young people want to drink it like from a fire hose. They're so hungry for alternatives and positive messages of what they can be versus what society's telling them they should be.
I think it's such an important aspect of the aspirational masculinity. And as you said, Susan, the aspirational humanity workshops and keynotes is that it really is intended to bring everyone into these conversations, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of times this issue is looked at as a woman's problem, a girl's problem, but really this is a problem that's affecting all genders. And it's important for us to all come together and think of how we can build a better world and a world where our children and the students that are going to school every day are safer, are more respectful communities that support each other. And so it's really been a beautiful thing to watch these programs grow. And as you said, Susan, we also focus a lot on consent in healthy relationships because, like you said, the legal definition of consent is really the bare minimum. And so I'd love to hear more from your point of view about why you think that programming is important as well and what you're seeing from students who are learning about healthy relationships, consent, and upstanding, and why you think it's important for our young people to have these workshops as well.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, by now, maybe our listeners have gotten the impression we're a little nerdy here. So I go back to my Latin roots and I love to break down words to find out their real meaning. And of course, con is from Latin. It means with, and sentire means to feel. So consent actually means to feel with another person. How amazing our world would be if we lived in the moment, trying to feel the dynamics of a situation with another person. So, Chessy will often say, The only thing I knew about consent, it was a form that you used to sign at the gymnastics park and before I went on the equipment. And she's right. I didn't teach her about consent. I didn't teach any of my daughters about consent when they were preteens or teens. But this is actually a whole way of living. It's not just to do with our physical and romantic relationships. It's how we use the minimum of respect for another person's voice and wishes and actions and how we interact. And I know, Katie, you do that with your children, but our inspiration for workshops, I would really be remiss if we didn't say, was originally back in 2018, it was the Georgetown Day School Summits on sexual assault and consent, which they hold annually. And they invited Chessy. We worked with an amazing advocate back then by the name of Angela Rose, and she invited Chessy to be on the first panel for the inaugural summit. And I told her not to do it. I said, why would you ever want to expose yourself, Chess, in front of all these students? Your classmates at St. Paul's have been so mean to you. They've taken out ads in the Boston Globe about how great their school is. Why would you want to expose yourself to these strangers? Somehow she had the courage to do it. And what we found was miraculous. These kids had started to be educated about consent and sexual assault. This is a really amazing school. And since then, we've partnered with them every year. This year, we'll be doing a number of workshops with them at their annual conference. Katie, you've been to the workshops now, and you understand the magic that happens there. So it's only once a year, though. And so we need to bring this into schools, regularly, so we can have the conversations with students about how does consent affect your friendships? How do you hear and say no to people? How are you brave in hearing and saying no? And really like debunking all the layers that keep people from communicating with each other honestly and reflecting on what their real feelings are about situations and not just being bullied or socially maneuvered into doing things. So, we think these consent workshops are the basis of creating safety and respect in schools. And we just invite you to reach out to us and hear more about what Consent 101 is, what Consent 102 is, and throughout high school and middle school. And I know what you're thinking, Katie, elementary school.
Definitely, definitely. And Susan, I'd love just to sort of go back to the criminal trial where in a lot of ways it was showing where you were going to go anyways. When the judge made a comment at the end of the criminal trial about consent that shows why young people need to understand consent. Could you explain what happened there and the comment that the judge made to the perpetrator?
So this was after the verdict had been rendered and the judge was making a summation of his thoughts. And Judge Smuckler, I have to say, was a very wise man in that he could get to the most salient point. And he said to Chessy's perpetrator, you did not know Miss Prout well enough to know whether she consented or not. They were acquaintances. They had never had any lengthy conversations. And that connection that they had that evening when he took her with the keys to the locked building was the first time they had ever spent any significant time together beyond on the walkways at school or on the school property. And I hope everyone lets that sink in, Katie. You did not know her well enough to know if she consented. You didn't know her to know that her staying stock still was her freezing. You didn't know her well enough to know her silence or her hand motions were signs of no, or that when she said no once, she meant it for everything. So, that is significant. We want that for all of our children and our students. We want them to have healthy, enjoyable relationships with one another when they are ready,
Right. And
when they know themselves well enough, when they know their partner well enough. And we can't tell them when that is, but you need to know that for yourself.
And those
And
are other important workshops that we do as
Yes.
well. I mean, Alex and I just spent a wonderful afternoon at a school in Virginia, and we talked about just that, right? The verbal and nonverbal signs of consent, how consent is defined, and also the neuroscience of trauma, how somebody's brain responds to fear and threats. It wasn't until Chessy attended the Georgetown Day School Summit where she really understood her own response in that threatening, traumatic situation. And it wasn't until she learned how the body and the brain responds to trauma where she could really understand why she responded in the way that she did and why it was not her fault. And we share with students that it's so important for them to understand this because, one, so that they can understand why they maybe react in a way that they didn't think they would react, but also so that they can have more compassion and empathy for people that they know and their peers if maybe they didn't react in the way that they thought they should have reacted. One thing that I'd love to hear a little bit more about is that we call our curriculum the Healthy Relationships and Empathetic Leadership Curriculum. And we named it that for a very specific purpose because while we are going in and teaching about consent and healthy relationships and trying to prevent sexual assault, it really is about so much more than that. It really gets into empathy, emotional intelligence, leadership. Can the two of you talk a little bit about how our programming helps to develop those muscles in our young people and why it's important?
sure, having spent 35 years in the corporate space, building and leading teams around the world, I've received a lot of training in terms of how the corporate world defines leadership, and that's evolved during my time in the industry. Well, the latest buzzwords in leadership circles are all around empathetic leadership, the ability to drive collaboration, communication, teamwork, the old stereotypical 1+1 = 3, unlocking the power of every employee. And these, I think, are very well researched attributes for modern day leadership. Unfortunately, we are not teaching our young people in schools in the structured world that they live in as young adults, as students, to practice this. When we speak to students, I think they all understand. They spend thousands of hours studying for tests so they can perform on the SATs or their AP finals. The students also spend hundreds of hours on sports fields or practicing instruments or singing for theater. And simple thing when I ask young people, if you were asked to take a test without studying, or if you're asked to step on the field and perform without practicing, how would you do? And the answer is very natural and quick. We will fail. We won't do well. So the fact is they spent that all that time building the muscle memory to perform in the stressful environments of a test or a sports game. And yet we want our people, young people, to go out into social situations on the weekend as young adults. We want them to, after they go off to university and join the workforce, we want them to do these things that they really have not practiced at all. You know, asking a young person, how do you think you will perform on a Saturday night seeing something happening that doesn't sit right with you? Are you going to have that practice skill to say, I've identified in my core that this, what's happening I'm seeing doesn't agree with how I feel as a human being? And are they going to have that gurgle up from their core to their attitudes and beliefs that are residing in their chest that might manifest itself with actions right through their mouth or through their muscles? And without practicing or thinking about it, we can't expect them to succeed. We should expect failure, just like they answered the questions on academics or sports if they don't practice. So I think there's a strong acknowledgement for young people. We need more discussions about how should we translate who we are as our core person. You know, we were just at that wonderful school where their core message is be you, and asking the students, do you understand who you are? What a great message your school is putting up front and center, be you. But are you doing the work to understand who are you and how will that manifest itself in these different situations. And, and that's why we also believe in addressing the ecosystem. That's a word that's very important to our org. We want to address all elements of the ecosystem, whether it's, if we look at a school, the ecosystem of the school is the parents, the adults who teach and administer and lead the school, the students. It could be the parents as well. It's the alumni. There are a lot of stakeholders in that ecosystem of the school, and we want all people, pushing in the same direction, understanding the same basic human elements that we believe in as an org, safety and respect. And that's where all of our programming flows come from.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to ask you about that, why it's important and what you've seen by addressing not just the students, because like you said, we provide keynotes and workshops to students, but I have the right to also provides professional development to educators and administrators, as well as parent workshops. And those discussions with parents are so important. And we're in middle schools, we're in high schools, we're in colleges, and we're also hoping to expand to elementary students as well, because it's important to start these conversations as early as possible. And really part of the goal is to make sure that every aspect of the community has the language, has the tools, has the resources to address these topics and support the young people. I'd
So
love to hear.
on that note, Katie, I just want to jump in and say, listen, 10 years ago when Chessy was assaulted, I considered myself to be a very well-educated, worldly person that could handle a lot of different kinds of situations. I was very proud of my ability to manage crisis, manage with any situation that came up. I was so ill-prepared as a man, as a father, as a partner to my wife when Chessy was assaulted. And the first thing I needed to let go of was I had to focus on reinforcing was my humility and lose my pride as a man to say, I know everything. And once you let that go and you realize you're open to learning and growing, the world is such a beautiful and exciting place. And with that experience and knowledge, that's why we so critically believe we need to speak to all the adults. Because if Susan and I weren't prepared, I think we could garner that most adults would be very ill prepared to deal with a problem that impacts 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys in our society. And so, but that takes, especially for men, it takes a touch of humility for us to acknowledge we don't have all the answers. We pride ourselves on pretending, right? And overcoming situations with our hubris and our, strength and enthusiasm. But this is something that when we get down to it, we need to have these basic conversations with all constituents, because I think our kids, our young people are the best prepared for this because they haven't layered on so many of these layers that constrict how us adults think we're allowed to behave, right? And they're still
Exactly.
learning.
Exactly. And like you said, the response to Chessie's assault was that a lot of people want to pretend that things like this don't happen. And I think with the Me Too movement and where we're at now, there's a realization in society with parents and with young people that this does happen and we need to be prepared for it as parents, as educators, and we also have to give our young people those tools. And what I'm reminded of every time we step in front of a student group is that students are ready for this messaging and they're hungry for it. Every single presentation I've been a part of, there are students that come up to us afterwards. We have many, many interns that join our organization and help us and want to move this mission forward, which has been really incredible. I know my own personal journey when I was an attorney and started this work 10 years ago, when I would share that I represented survivors of sexual abuse, a lot of people didn't want to talk about it. They would say, "Oh, what kind of attorney are you?" And I would say, "I represent survivors of sexual abuse." And then they'd want to talk about the weather. That's not how it is now. People want to know, they want to understand, and they want to know what they can do differently. I did have a question that I wanted to ask both of you before we sort of get into how we envision the future of this podcast and what people can expect. So, Alex, the question is first for you. So, I know you shared a story right before Chessy's assault that you were standing at a water cooler and having a conversation with another person that you worked with. Can you share a little bit about what that conversation was and what you would have told yourself in that at that time, knowing everything you know now?
So 3 months before Chessy was assaulted, I was in my office in Hong Kong. It was a regular day. I was reading the New York Times earlier that morning, and I saw an article that said 1 in 4 girls will be sexually assaulted before they graduate university. And I brought up that article to a colleague at the water cooler, and I said, oh my gosh, I've got 3 daughters. My oldest daughter is about to head to university. Statistically, this is likely to happen to our family. And then, I made that statement, but I read the article and it was like in one ear and out the other. I didn't think about it again until I received the phone call from Susan. And I keep on referring back to that story because I wish I was better informed prior to my daughter's assault. If I had understood the statistics and the likelihood of it happening, obviously you would be better prepared, right? If you had a 20% chance of being in a car accident, you would make sure you have proper insurance, car insurance. You probably take some special awareness and, take the precautions necessary and make sure if it does happen that you're emotionally equipped to that. So if I had to talk back to that person at the water cooler, number one, if I were the person I was speaking to, I wish I'd told myself, you know what, research this a little bit more. It's worth the time and attention, but also don't be so stressed because you're full of love. Love can help you get through anything. Trust love and trust yourself and your loved ones. And don't worry one crap about what assholes around you think.
Right. And that the path will appear. You'll learn what the right things are to do if you just trust and keep your child at the center of all your decision making. And that was something that, we were definitely a team. We would always go back and forth and kind of check ourselves. And thankfully, like a battery where we're never both the negative end of the battery or vice versa, right? So when one of us would kind of want to just rail at something, the other person would say, okay, let it out. But now let's talk about what's practical. We'd call it, are we scratching an itch? Or are we thinking about Chessy and our family's welfare and her sister's well-being? So that's really important too, I think. And I credit my husband with that. He is so steady and even though it was his school, I just always thought that you were so generous about how to handle everything.
Well, we share one attribute that I think helped us, which was tenacity and stubbornness, because there are a lot of things stacked against survivors. But I think what people should realize is any adversity that you face is truly just noise. There's no, life will move on, life will continue, and life can continue to get better after the bumpy parts of the journey. But there's so many people trying to tell you how to behave, how to think, how to act.
We had people tell us, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? But what we hear from survivors, Katie, is that they're afraid of how their parents are going to react. They're afraid this will tear their family apart. They're afraid that their parents' relationship won't survive this. And, there are no guarantees. A lot of things do happen in families. Parents do find that they have a hard time staying united in these situations. So parents need to know kids are afraid for their families, but we're supposed to be the lighthouses. We're not supposed to get in the boat with our kids. We're supposed to be the lighthouse and to guide the way and not fall into the cycle of trauma. I mean, yes, it hurts. And yes, we can all be supported by counseling, but
That's
primarily,
such an
we're not the primary victim there. Our kid is.
That's such an important visual, visualizing yourself as the lighthouse instead of being in the boat. And I think a couple of things that the two of you said is, Alex, you had mentioned if you know the chances of a car accident, you buy car insurance and you buy as safe of a car as you can. I mean, it's just these programs are just the same as putting a seatbelt on your kid before you drive off in a car, right? You're giving them the safety that you want them to have. That's what these workshops and these conversations do for these young people. And Susan, like you said, having these conversations before anything happens to let them know they don't have to be scared and that they can come to you and they can come to other people in their lives and get support. And it's so important to give that support and those resources to young people, but also to give the tools to parents so that they can appropriately and adequately support the young people in their lives. And one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, Susan, in particular, before we get into our vision for the podcast's future, is that Chessy shared with you that she's at a point in her healing journey where there's been a pivot. I'd love for you, if you remember what I'm talking about, which I think that you do, if you can share that, because it really is such an important moment. And I think it shows a lot of what we've been able to accomplish as an org and what our future looks like.
Thank you, Katie. She said recently, she said, Mom, I can now say that more good has happened to me since my assault than bad through the assault. And I'm so grateful. She didn't say that with prompting. She just reflected that one day. And that is a credit to the people that have loved her, people that have supported her, the community that's amassed around her, her openness to it, her ability to allow that healing into her life. So I'm so grateful for it. I mean, she has amazing friendships and relationships all around her. And yeah, most of them are all post her high school experience at St. Paul's School. So, she had to really work at it.
What an important message for survivors that you can get somewhere, you can get to a point in your healing journey like that, like where Chessy has gotten. I think that's so inspirational. So we're here today. This is our second episode of our podcast, hopefully with many, many more to come. I'd love to hear, how does this podcast fit into the larger mission of the organization? What are you envisioning? What are some voices and topics that we plan to cover? What can our listeners expect going forward?
So, I know, Katie, we've talked about this idea for a long time together. And I think we were all sitting together in my dining room with some young people. And actually, the daughter of one of our board members, and she said, oh my gosh, this conversation around this table is so important. This should be on a podcast that we can all listen to and learn from. And so when a young person said that to us, we kind of all said, bingo, that's it. We're doing it. And that's why we're here. We want to reach as many people as we can with this very, very hopeful idea that your voice matters, your experience matters. We can all learn from it and we can all grow together. We all have the right to safety and respect and a life free from sexual assault. And what we've learned in these 10 years is that sexual violence is rampant. It knows no economic boundaries, and that men and women, non-binary and LGBTQ plus are all affected. We are all in this together, and it behooves a productive society and world to do something about this scourge. One of our great friends and neighbors said to us, and he's in his 80s, he said, sexual violence is the greatest scourge of our society. And I think he's right. I mean, there's so many problems that will be solved if we took a systems thinking approach to sexual violence. You know, women's safety would empower women to do so many more things in their lives. And we have a great friend and psychologist, Peter Prine, who's drawn me a beautiful chart that solving for interpersonal violence and violence against women could ultimately solve for food crises and the environmental issues if we could just empower half the population. And so, I mean, we won't get into that level of detail right now. We'll wait until maybe the 4th episode. But that's what it's all about, looking at this holistically and how we can solve for this terrible scourge that takes lives away, that diminishes lives, and it creates generational trauma. So we want to get to the root of it and put a stop to it as much as we can.
And, this podcast also gives us the ability to reach different members of that ecosystem in different ways with different kinds of information. So I know for Susan and I, we don't want any parent to not be equipped with important information. God forbid, should this topic impact a loved one. So I think that it can be one sort of, vein that we, explore and build a community. But, from my perspective personally on I view this Aspire title to be a very important one, especially when it comes to the topic of masculinity. And we will be debuting a series of podcasts co-hosted by 2 young students from a school that we've worked with in the past. And it is an exciting podcast about talking about real men and real conversations and aspirational masculinity. How can we be the best version of who we are as men? And, to me, it's a fascinating journey with these episodes we're doing to explore the challenges that young people face in terms of how do you live in your wholeness when society is telling you that you can only be a certain part of yourself as a functioning man in society. And so that's an exciting conversation, I think, for all men, because I know I face it in the workplace. I'm feel constricted at times at home in terms of my relationship with Suze or with other people in terms of the limitations of socially constructed masculinity. And we all, I think, should aspire to be the best versions of ourselves. So, we do have, the ability to open up these kinds of conversations with the podcast as well.
Yes, it's incredibly exciting to have you speaking with our young people and other experts in the field about aspirational masculinity and how to include everyone in those conversations. And Susan, I know you and I are going to spend a lot of time speaking with survivors and other experts in the field. Anything you want to share about what people can expect through those conversations?
Oh my gosh. I think you're going to get a glimpse of our daily work. And the books we're reading, the authors we're inspired by, the events that are happening right before our eyes in the world that we feel are significant. But most of all, I hope we can all come together to empower each other, especially the younger generation too, to make the changes that basically we have not succeeded in making yet.
Susan and Alex, this has been such a delightful and informative conversation. I'm feeling really inspired. So, one final message you want to leave with the listeners today before we wrap it up?
You have the power to make change.
And your voice is your superpower. We are here to empower young people. We're here to encourage adults to continue to learn and grow, and to find the common ground. We all want the same thing. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.